I've told this story maybe 4 times in 7 years, twice to my brother, once to a doctor who asked why I don't sleep well, and once badly at a wedding after too much wine to a man who didn't ask. This is the 5th time, and I want to get it right. My name's Ray Dunmore. I drive a coach. 54 years old from Leeds, 40 of those years spent looking at the backs of other people's heads through a mirror. I've driven school trips, football supporters, funeral parties, a hen do that I still don't talk about. I know the M1 the way some men know a wife's face, every crack in it, every mood. And on Thursdays in summer, I drive tourists into London. That's how I ended up standing on Birdcage Walk on the 27th of June, in a heat that had gone past pleasant 3 days earlier and turned into something with a temper. Let me set it for you, because the setting matters. Everything that happened after only makes sense if you can feel the day first. It was hot, not summer hot, wrong hot, the kind of heat that makes tarmac smell like something dying. You could see it lifting off the road in ripples, like the street was breathing badly. My shirt had been wet since 10:30 and I'd stopped noticing. I'd parked the coach where I always park, dropped 41 people from a coach tour company that no longer exists, and told them what I always tell them. 11:15 at the coach, and if you're late I will leave without you, and yes, I mean it, and no, I never have. Then I did what I always do. I walked. 40 minutes. That's my window while they photograph everything. I walk down past the park railings, buy a coffee I don't need, and I stand near the gates and I watch the guard. I don't know why. I'm not a royalist. Never was. My father would have had something to say about a grown man standing in the sun watching another grown man stand in the sun. But there's something about it. A man holding still while the whole world moves. The crowd that day was thick, thicker than usual. School holidays hadn't started yet, but there was a Spanish school group in matching yellow caps, a swarm of them, all elbows and phone screens. 2 lads from somewhere in the north, I heard the vowels arguing about whether the bearskin hats were real bear. There was a woman selling flags from a folding table. A busker playing something on a violin that wasn't quite in tune, but he played it with his eyes shut, so you forgave him. An ice cream van idled by the corner. Engine running the whole time, that generator sound, that low chug you stop hearing after a minute. And every so often the chimes would go, 3 notes, cut off halfway, like the man in the van kept changing his mind. There was a little boy in a paper crown. Gold card, glitter on it, 1 point already bent over. He was maybe 5. He kept trying to salute the guard and getting it wrong, palm out, fingers in the wrong place, and then hiding behind his dad's leg. I remember the pigeons, dozens of them. They'd learned where the crumbs fell. And I remember the smell of the coach's brakes, faint, following me down the road the way it always does. Hot metal, something almost sweet in it. Small things. That's what a day is made of until it isn't. The guard was young. That's the first thing I noticed. And it's the thing I noticed again later, when noticing had become a different kind of thing entirely. He looked about 22, maybe 23, sunburnt across the back of the neck, that raw stripe you get between the collar and the hairline where nobody thinks to put cream. His chin strap sat tight enough to leave a mark. I could see the mark. He was on sentry, standing at his post, boots together, rifle at his side, eyes forward and slightly up, the way they do like they're looking at something just above the crowd that only they can see. Motionless. And I mean motionless in a way that goes past the word. I've watched a lot of them over the years. Some of them, if you're patient, you catch a blink or a shift of weight or a swallow. This one gave you nothing. He was so still that the stillness became a thing in itself, like a held note. You started watching for the break the way you watch a glass on the edge of a table. I later learned his name. It took a while and it came to me sideways, and I'm not going to pretend I knew it at the time. To me, that day, he was just the young one with the burnt neck. Guardsman Elliot Vance, 23. I'll use his name from here. He's earned it. Around 10:30, the heat did something odd. There was a change in the air, not a breeze, the opposite of a breeze. It was as though someone had shut a door somewhere very large. The violin busker stopped mid-phrase, looked up, frowned, and started again. I thought storm coming, that's all, that drop in pressure you feel behind the eyes. I bought my coffee, kept walking. A woman came past me pushing a wheelchair, and I stepped aside for her the way you do, and we did that small dance of two people being polite. In the chair was an old lady with hands folded on a handbag and a hat that had seen better summers. Wide brim, cream, a silk flower on it coming loose. The daughter said sorry to me, and I said you're all right, and that was that. 4 seconds, nothing. Except I looked at the old woman as they went past, and she was looking straight up at the sky, mouth slightly open, absolutely delighted about something. Not at the palace, at the sky. Like the blue itself was the attraction, and she'd waited a long time for it. I don't know why that stayed with me, it just did. Her name was Nora. She was 88. Her daughter was called Selina, and she was 51 and had taken a day off work. I know these things now. I didn't know them then. Here's the part where I have to be careful, because memory is a liar, and I've had 7 years to decorate this. So I'll tell you only what I'd swear to. At about 10:45, I smelled something. Hot pennies, that's the closest I can get. Copper and burning, the smell you get when a plug melts, faint. It came and went. I actually turned around looking for a food van because I thought someone had a griddle going wrong. Nothing. Then a bit later, and I couldn't tell you how much later, could be 2 minutes, could be 6, I noticed the streetlight. Middle of the day, blazing sun, and the streetlight, one of the tall ones on the far pavement, was on, not steady, flickering, on, a stutter like it was trying to say something in a language nobody speaks anymore. I remember thinking, someone wants to know about that. And I remember doing absolutely nothing about it, because what do you do? Who do you tell? Who is in charge of a streetlight? That thought has cost me a lot of sleep, not because it would have changed anything. It wouldn't have. But because I stood there and I saw, and I filed it under not my business, and 11 minutes later people were screaming. The pigeons went first. All of them at once. Not the usual scatter, where one goes and the rest follow like idiots. This was every bird on that stretch of road lifting off the ground in the same half-second, like the pavement had thrown them. The sound of it, that whip-crack of 100 wings, made the whole crowd look up. The Spanish kids laughed. Someone said something and someone else laughed. The busker didn't. He was already packing his violin. I watched him do it. He'd stopped playing and he was crouched down with the case open, and he was moving fast, and I couldn't work out why, and I remember feeling almost annoyed with him, the way you get annoyed at someone who leaves a party early. Later I found out he'd been in Sarajevo as a boy. He knew what the birds meant. Then came the hum. You have to understand, a London street is never quiet. There's traffic, there's a helicopter somewhere, there's the generator on the ice cream van, there's 200 people talking. It's a wall of sound, and you live inside it and you don't hear it. The hum came from underneath. Low, under my feet, in my feet. It came up through the soles of my shoes and into my shins, and it had a pitch to it, a horrible sort of tuning fork drone that made the coffee shiver in the cup in my hand. I looked down because that's what you do. You look at your own shoes as though your shoes might explain it. And I saw the drain cover. 20 feet away on the road side of the railings, one of those big iron squares set into the pavement, and there was smoke coming out of it. Not a lot, a thread of it, gray-white, coming up in a lazy curl the way steam comes off a cup of tea. And it was bouncing. The drain cover, iron, must weigh 60-70 kilos. It was rattling in its frame. Tap, 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 like something underneath was knocking politely and losing patience. I want to tell you I acted, that I shouted, that I grabbed people, that I was some sort of man. I stood there. I stood there with a coffee I didn't want, looking at a drain, and my brain, my useless 40 years of motorways brain, said quite calmly, that's the gas. Or the electric. That's a fault. Someone will come. And then I looked up. And I looked, of all places, at the guard. I don't know why. Reflex, maybe. In an unfamiliar room, you look at the person who lives there. And he was the only person on that street who was supposed to be there. Everybody else was passing through. He belonged. Guardsman Vance was looking straight ahead. His eyes hadn't moved. His hands hadn't moved. Nothing about him had changed at all. Except, I've thought about this so many times, and I know how it sounds. And I know that 7 years is long enough to invent a detail and then believe it. But I'd swear to this too. His jaw was tight. There was a small muscle going just under the burnt line of his cheek. And his hand, the one on the rifle, his knuckles had gone white. He knew. He'd heard it. He'd smelled it. He'd been standing on that spot for 3/4 of an hour with his boots on that pavement, and he'd felt that hum come up through the ground the way I had. And he was not moving. I'll tell you what I thought, and I'm not proud of it. I thought, what an idiot. I thought, there's a man who's been drilled so hard he can't think. I thought about my father, who worked in a mill, who used to say that the army takes a lad and puts a lid on him. I stood there, and I judged that boy for standing still. That's the sentence I'd take back if I could take one back. Not what I did, what I thought. Because it took me years to understand what he was actually doing. And I only understood it when a woman I'd never met sat across a table from me and explained it in 9 words. But we're not there yet. The old woman in the wheelchair, Nora, had ended up parked near the railings, in a bit of shade, about 15 feet from that drain. Her daughter had stepped away, 6, 7 steps. She was buying 2 bottles of water from a kiosk, that's all. She'd turned her back for the length of a transaction. I can still see her doing it, fumbling in a purse, the little frown of someone counting coins in a country where the coins feel wrong. And Nora sat in her chair in the shade with her handbag on her lap and her hat with the loose silk flower, and she was watching the guard. Not the palace, not the crowd. Him. She had a look on her face that I've only ever seen on my own mother near the end, when she'd look at me and be seeing someone else. A softness, a very old memory doing its work behind the eyes. I found out afterwards from Selina that Nora's husband had done his national service in a uniform not unlike that one, and that he'd been dead 19 years, and that she still laid out 2 cups every morning and only noticed halfway through. 88 years old, in a wheelchair in the wrong kind of heat, 15 feet from a drain that was starting to bounce. The hum changed key. That's the only way I can put it. It went up. It went from a drone to something with an edge on it, and the drain cover stopped tapping and started hammering. A fast, hard, metal-on-metal clatter that finally made people turn. A man near me said, "What the hell is that?" Someone laughed. Somebody actually laughed out of nerves, that awful little bark people do. The ice cream van's chimes started up, 3 notes cut off. And the smoke stopped being a thread. It came up in a sudden gray column, thick as a man, and it stank, that hot penny stink, but multiplied, an acid electrical reek that made the back of your throat close. The Spanish kids started shouting. Their teacher was clapping her hands, gathering them, and her voice had gone very high. Selina turned round at the kiosk with a bottle of water in each hand. And I saw her face change. I've seen a lot of faces. Behind a windscreen you become a student of faces. I have never seen one change like that. It was as if someone reached inside her and switched her off and switched a different woman on. The bottles were still in her hands. She'd forgotten she had hands. She started to run. And that's when the crowd went. Here's what nobody tells you about a crowd turning. It doesn't happen in a wave. It happens in every direction at once. It's not a stampede in the way films do it, everyone charging one way like water. It's chaos, because half the people are running from the smoke and half don't know where the smoke is and are running towards it, and a third lot are standing still, filming, because a phone in your hand makes you feel like a witness instead of a participant. I got hit twice in the first 4 seconds, once in the shoulder by a big lad in a football shirt, once in the ribs by a rucksack. My coffee went. I remember it going. I remember watching the cup hit the pavement and the lid come off and the whole thing bloom out brown across the paving stones. And I remember in the middle of everything, thinking that's my coffee gone, because the brain is a stupid animal and it grabs at small things while the big thing arrives. The busker was already 30 yards away, running with the violin case under his arm like a rugby ball. The ice cream van driver got out, took one look and got back in. The little boy in the paper crown lost his crown. I watched it come off. Gold card, glitter, one bent point. It went up in the churn of legs and it came down and a shoe went through it, and his father had him up on a hip and was already gone. The paper crown lay on the pavement, torn nearly in half, and people ran over it and over it and over it. And through all of that, every bit of it, Guardsman Elliot Vance did not move. I want you to picture it, because I've never been able to stop. A road full of people coming apart, screaming. A column of smoke 15 feet high. Someone's shopping bag burst open and oranges rolling everywhere, and a woman on her knees trying to get her phone, and the teacher screaming names in Spanish over and over. And behind it all, framed by the black railings, a young man in red and black stands at his post with his rifle at his side and his eyes forward. Perfectly, impossibly still. The smoke drifted across him and I lost him for a second, and when it cleared he was exactly where he had been. Not an inch given. Nothing. There was a moment, and I'd swear to this, and Selena swears to it too, and she was closer than I was, where the smoke got in his eyes and they streamed. Tears coming down both cheeks, cutting clean lines through the grime that was starting to settle on his face. And his eyes never closed. I know how this reads. I know it sounds like a man in a story. But there is a reason. There is always a reason, and I didn't understand it for 3 years, and I want to tell it to you now before the rest, because otherwise you'll spend the second half of this thinking what I thought. That sentry post wasn't a decoration. Behind him, through that gate, was a route, a cleared route. And behind that route were people whose job began the second something like this started, people who had to come through that gate, fast, in vehicles, in the next 90 seconds. If the crowd surged at that gate, and a crowd running from smoke surges at anything that looks like a way out, then that route closes. And if that route closes, nothing comes through it. His post was the reason the road behind him stayed clear. Not tradition. Not a photograph, not a bearskin hat and a stiff upper lip, and all the rubbish I'd been carrying in my head for years while I drank coffee and watched them like they were statues. He was holding a door open. And the way you hold that door open, when 1,000 frightened people are looking for somewhere to run, is that you stand in front of it and you do not move, and every single person who looks at you thinks that isn't a way out, that's a soldier, and they go somewhere else. He held that gate with his body and his stillness and nothing else. 9 words is what Selena said to me 3 years later in Acosta near Houston, when I finally told her I'd thought he was an idiot. She said he wasn't ignoring it, he was standing between it and everyone. But I didn't know that. Standing on Birdcage Walk at 11 minutes to 11 on the 27th of June, all I knew was that a drain was screaming, and an old woman in a wheelchair was 15 feet from it, alone in a bit of shade, with her handbag on her lap. Selena was running, but there were 40 people between her and her mother, all going the other way. She went down. I saw her go down. Somebody's knee, somebody's bag, and she was on the pavement, and the water bottles were rolling, and she was screaming a name I couldn't hear. Nora didn't move. I don't think she'd fully understood. She turned her head towards the smoke, and she'd gripped her handbag with both hands, the way you do on a bus when it breaks. An 88-year-old woman, holding her handbag tighter. That's what she did with the last calm seconds of that morning. And I started towards her. I want that on the record, because I've been hard on myself for 7 years and I'm allowed one thing. I started. I got maybe 4 steps, and a man came the other way at full speed with his head down, and he took me off my feet like I was made of paper, and I went into the railings shoulder first, and I felt something go in my collarbone, and the whole street tipped sideways. I was on my knees, ears ringing, a hand on the hot iron. And I looked up through the legs, and the smoke and the noise, at that gate. At him. At the young man with the burnt neck, who hadn't moved a muscle in 50 minutes. And I saw his eyes come down. For the first time. Off the middle distance, off whatever point above the crowd they'd been fixed on. Down. Left. To a bit of shade by the railings where an old woman sat alone in a wheelchair with her hands round a handbag. I saw a soldier's face do something that faces like that are trained not to do. His mouth opened just slightly, and he took one short breath, the kind you take before you say a thing you can't take back. And then the drain cover came off. I've read the report, all 11 pages of it twice, sitting at my kitchen table with a pen I never used. It says the failure happened in a junction chamber under the pavement. It says there was water where water shouldn't have been. It uses the phrase arc fault, which I have since looked up more times than a sane man would, and it says that the pressure in that chamber built for somewhere between 4 and 9 minutes before the cover failed. 4 to 9 minutes. That's how long that boy stood there with it going off under his boots. The report does not mention him. Not once. He isn't in it. There's a paragraph about crowd dispersal and a paragraph about emergency vehicle access, and neither of them has a name in it. So I suppose that's what this is. Somebody has to put him in the record. The cover didn't fly. That's the first thing people get wrong when I tell them. You imagine it going up like a coin flipped off a thumb. It didn't. It came up about a foot, tilted and slammed back down half in and half out of its frame, and the sound, God, the sound wasn't a bang. It was a crack and a boom stacked on top of each other, and then a long tearing hiss, like the world's biggest kettle giving up. And the light. That's the thing nobody believes. There was light coming out of that hole, blue-white, brighter than the sun in full sun at 11 o'clock in June. It threw shadows upward. For half a second every railing on that street had a shadow going the wrong way, up the wall behind it, and I remember seeing my own hand lit from below like a torch under a chin at a campfire. Then the smell hit properly. Not pennies anymore. Burning rubber and something chemical and sweet, and under it faintly the smell of a struck match multiplied 1,000 times. My ears did the thing where they stop working and start whistling instead. And through the whistle, through all of it, I heard one sound clearly. A voice. He shouted. That's what he did. That was his first move, and it took me years to understand that it was a move, and a trained one, and probably the single most important thing anybody did on that street that morning. He didn't run. He didn't leave the gate. He turned his head maybe 15 degrees and he opened his lungs, and he put out a voice that I felt in my chest from 30 feet away. I couldn't tell you the words. Something like move back that way, and something else sharper that might have been an instruction and might have been a name. But it wasn't the words, it was the tone. You have to understand what a crowd is when it's frightened. It's not people anymore. It's one animal with 200 legs and no head, and an animal with no head will follow the first voice it hears that sounds like it knows something. Everyone had been screaming. Screaming is just noise. It tells the animal nothing except be more afraid. And then this one voice came over the top of all of it, and it wasn't afraid. It was flat and hard and certain, and it told the animal where to go. And the animal went. I watched a crowd that had been coming apart in every direction turn like a shoal of fish and pour west, away from the smoke, down the pavement, past the ice cream van, out into the open. In 3 seconds, maybe 4. Not because of me, or the police, who hadn't arrived. Because a 23-year-old with a burnt neck opened his mouth and sounded like he had the right to be obeyed. Which left the pavement in front of the railings almost empty. Almost. Selena was still down. She'd been trampled, properly trampled, the kind that breaks fingers, and it had broken 2 of hers, though she didn't know that yet. She was crawling, not running, crawling on her elbows towards a wheelchair 15 feet from a hole in the ground that was now throwing sparks in long white arcs, and something in that hole was still building. The chair had rolled. That's the bit that finishes me. The pavement there has a camber. All pavements do for the rain. And in all the shoving, someone had knocked the chair and the brake had been off or come off, and the chair had rolled maybe 4 feet. Towards the drain. Nora was still holding her handbag with both hands. She was sitting very straight in the chair the way women of that generation sat, and her hat had come off and was on the ground beside her with the silk flower properly loose now, hanging by a thread, and she was making no sound at all. I've asked myself 100 times whether she understood. Selena says she did. Selena says her mother wasn't confused for a single day of her life, and that she'd have known exactly, precisely what was about to happen, and that she'd have decided, in that moment, not to be undignified about it. 88 years old, 4 feet from it, sitting straight holding her bag. And here is the 60 seconds I have been building towards for 2 parts, and I'm going to tell it slowly, because it happened slowly, and because I have never once been able to tell it fast. Guardsman Vance was at his post. His post was the gate. Behind that gate was the cleared route. Down that route in the next minute or so would come the vehicles that had to come. That is not a story I'm telling you. That is a fact, and it is why he was standing there, and every second he stood there was a second that route stayed open, and every person on that street who looked at him and thought not that way was a person who did not clog it. If he left the gate was just a gate. And in front of him, 15 feet away, no, less now, the chair had rolled, an old woman was going to die. He had no radio in his hand. His rifle was not a tool for this. There was nobody else. The nearest police officer was still coming round the corner of the road and had not yet seen the wheelchair because the smoke was between them. There was one man on that street who could reach her. And leaving his post was, and is, one of the very few things a soldier of that regiment is taught he must not do. I saw his hand move first. The one on the rifle. The knuckles had been white for minutes, and now the whole hand shifted, just an inch, and gripped differently. His head came round, fully round, and he looked at the drain, at the light coming out of it, at the arcs, and then at the chair, and then at the gate behind him, and then, and I will believe this until they put me in the ground, he looked at me. Straight at me, kneeling by the railings with a broken collarbone and blood on my shirt from my own chin. I was the closest thing on that pavement to another pair of hands. And I was on my knees, useless. I've spent 7 years wanting to tell him I'm sorry about that. Then he went. Nobody was ready for how fast he was. There's a way people move in that uniform that we all know from the videos, that clipped, hammering, deliberate march. Everyone thinks that's how they move. It isn't. That's ceremonial. That's a costume for a way of walking. What I saw was a young, fit soldier drop, everything ornamental, and run. The rifle went. Not thrown, grounded. He put it down against the railing base in one motion without breaking stride, and I remember thinking even then that even in the middle of it he wasn't dropping anything, he was placing it. The bearskin came off at the second stride. He hit the strap with the heel of his hand, and the whole thing went backwards off his head and rolled on the pavement, and I never saw it again. And underneath it he was just a lad. Sweat-soaked hair flattened to his skull, a red groove across his forehead where the leather had bitten in for an hour, a face gone absolutely white under the sunburn. Just a lad, running at a hole in the ground that was throwing white fire. He covered that 15 feet in, I don't know, 2 seconds. It felt like a week. He didn't grab the chair by the handles. That's the detail that tells you he thought about it. Handles are at the back. To grab the handles, he'd have had to go around the chair, on the drain side. He came in from the front, at an angle, and he took the frame under the armrests with both hands, and he lifted the front wheels and pivoted the whole thing on its back axle. Hard, so violently that Nora's head snapped back, and then he was behind it and driving it away from the drain at a dead sprint with the small wheels off the ground entirely. 8 feet 10, 12. And then the chamber let go for the second time. I didn't see it. I had my arm up over my face by then, which is what your body does without asking you. I felt it. It came through the pavement into my knees and up through the railings into my hand, and it hurt, physically hurt in my teeth. There was a sound like a shipping container being dropped from a height, and the drain cover, 60, 70 kilos of iron, did come out this time, and it went about 20 feet along the road and took the front wheel arch off a parked car. And a wall of hot air went over the top of us, and it was carrying grit, and it stripped the leaves off the plane tree behind me. Just took them. Green leaves in June, off in a second, and they came down for the next half-minute like a sarcastic sort of snow. When I got my arm down, there were 2 people on the pavement. The wheelchair was on its side, one wheel still going round. Nora was on the ground, and he was on top of her. He tipped it deliberately. Selena worked that out later, from where the chair was and where they were and which way they were facing. He'd got another 2, 3 feet of distance, and then he'd rolled the chair over away from the blast and gone down with it and put himself between her and the hole. His back was to it. I want to say I got there first. I didn't. Selena got there first, on her hands and knees with 2 broken fingers, and she got to them and she was making a sound I can't describe and don't want to. I got there second. He was already moving, trying to get up, and he couldn't quite because the first thing he did was try to get up without putting any weight on Nora, and he'd landed badly, and his left leg wasn't taking it. His tunic was scorched across the shoulders. I don't mean burning. I mean the surface of it had gone dark and rough, like bread left too long, and there were little holes in it where the grit had come through. The back of his neck, that sunburnt stripe I'd been looking at for an hour, had been sandblasted raw. And he said, this is the first thing he said to me, to Selena, to anyone. He said, is she all right? Is she check her hip? Check her hip, she'll have gone on the hip. That's it, that's what came out of him. Not am I on fire, not help me. Check her hip. She had fractured hip, fractured wrist, and she was 88, and everybody knows what a broken hip means at that age. She lived 4 more years. I want to say that here, right in the middle, before we get to the rest of it, because I've told this story to people who assumed she died, and I've watched their faces, and I'm not putting anyone through that. Nora Bulai lived 4 more years. She was at her granddaughter's wedding in a chair in a blue dress, and she was very funny about the chair, apparently. She told everyone she'd been rescued from a volcano, which is not accurate but is, I think, close enough in the ways that count. Now, the bit that made me put all this down. Guardsman Elliot Vance left his post. He put his rifle down, and he took his headdress off in public, and he abandoned a sentry position in front of a crowd of civilians and several dozen phone cameras. You can find the footage. There are 3 or 4 clips of it. Shaky, screaming, mostly smoke. In one of them you can see him for about a second and a half, running with the chair. And what happened after was this. The internet decided it knew what it had seen. For about 18 hours he was a hero. And then, because this is the world we've made, a certain kind of person started asking why a royal guard had deserted his position, and whether standards had slipped, and there was a phrase that went around, panicked and bolted, and it was in a newspaper. Not a big one, but it was in a newspaper, next to a picture taken from an angle that made it look like he was running away from the smoke rather than into it. And the regiment said nothing. They never say anything. That's the whole point of them. They don't explain themselves, and they don't correct you, and they don't come on the television. So for a while, for a few weeks, a young man who had a burn across his shoulders that needed dressing twice a day was, in certain corners, a coward. I didn't know any of that at the time. I was in a hospital getting a collarbone strapped and answering questions from a policewoman who was extremely kind and about 19. I found out 3 years later, in a Costa near Euston from Selena. She tracked me down through the coach company, which no longer existed, which tells you something about how hard she'd tried. She was 54 by then, gray coming in. She had a folder with her, an actual cardboard folder, and in it was everything she'd been able to gather in 3 years of trying to get someone to say his name out loud. She'd written to the regiment, twice. She got back 2 letters that were polite and said nothing. She'd written to the newspaper, nothing. And she said to me across a table with 2 cold coffees on it, "They won't say it, so we have to." And then she told me the thing about the gate, about the route, about what he'd been doing for that hour, which I had watched with a coffee in my hand and dismissed as a man being a statue. And I said, because I'm not a good man, I'm just a man who was there, I said. I thought he was an idiot. I stood there and I thought he'd been drilled stupid. And she didn't get angry with me. She just looked at me for a moment. And she said, he wasn't ignoring it. He was standing between it and everyone. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand then. And it took a 54-year-old woman with a cardboard folder to teach it to me. Standing still is not the absence of doing something. That is the whole lie of my life, right there. I'd spent 40 years driving, and I thought that motion was action and stillness was waiting. And I stood on Birdcage Walk, and I watched a man do the hardest thing a human being can do, which is to feel the ground shake and stay exactly where he is, because his staying there is holding something up, and I thought he was empty. Everything he did that day was one decision made twice. The first time he chose to stay, when every animal instinct in him and every scream in that street was pulling him away. He chose the gate. He chose the 100 people who'd come through it over the 100 and one who'd have run through it. And the second time, when there was no one else and the maths changed, he chose to go, instantly, without hesitating, knowing, and he did know, he'd have known better than anyone what leaving would cost him. He wasn't a machine that stood still. He was a man who'd worked out what standing still was for, and the second it stopped being for that, he moved. The stillness and the running were the same thing. He was not disciplined. I know that much. Selena got that much, eventually, from a warrant officer who spoke to her on a telephone for 4 minutes and gave her nothing except, right at the end, unprompted, in a completely different voice, "You should know that nobody in this regiment thinks he did anything wrong. Not one of us." And then he said goodbye and put the phone down, and she sat in her kitchen and cried for 20 minutes. She never spoke to him, to Vance. She wanted to. She wrote him a letter, care of the regiment, and she never knew if it arrived. I've never spoken to him either. I don't know where he is. He'd be 30 now. He might be out. He might be somewhere very different with a very different life and no wish at all to be reminded. If he ever sees this, and he won't, they never do, I'd only want to say one thing. I was the man on his knees at the railings, the one you looked at, and I'm sorry I wasn't more used to you. There's one more thing. About 3 weeks after I was back. Same run, same Thursday, same parking spot. Coach company insisted. Life does that. It just carries on and the tarmac gets resurfaced, and there's a new drain cover that's a slightly different color from all the others and you'd only notice if you knew. I walked down Habit, bought a coffee I didn't want. There was a new guard on the gate, older, broader, nothing like him. And at the base of the railings, tucked in behind the bottom rail where the wind wouldn't take it, somebody had left a paper crown. Gold card, glitter, torn nearly in half and taped back together badly by hands that were probably about 5 years old, with about 4 times as much tape as the job required. One point still bent over. Nobody had moved it. The guard had stood over it all morning and hadn't touched it and wouldn't have. It sat there in the sun getting slowly ruined by the weather and everybody walked past it, and nobody knew what it was. I stood on that pavement for a long time. And I thought about a boy who'd lost his crown running and come back to give it to somebody and never got to hand it over. And I thought about all the people going past, hundreds of them, phones up, laughing, doing exactly what I'd done for years, looking at a man in a red tunic standing perfectly still and thinking there was nothing happening. There's always something happening. That's the thing I've carried for 7 years, and I'll carry it out the other side. The stillest thing you'll ever see is a man taking the whole weight of something, so that you never have to know it was there. You'll walk past him, you'll take a photograph, you'll get back on your coach, and he'll still be standing.